Good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Pam Cameron. I'm an MLA for South Antrim, representing the DUP. You have to get a wee plug in because we're in an election period here, and it's always good to do a bit of canvassing. You're very welcome to Parliament Buildings today. A lovely, beautiful, sunny day. I hope you will, some of you even will avail of the tour of the building. It's a very beautiful building. It's a pleasure to have worked here since 2011, since election. I must apologise in advance. I have to leave straight away because I'm supposed to be at a health committee meeting for the rest of the afternoon. So it looks like a very interesting seminar. I'm sorry I'm going to not be able to stay to hear the presentations, but I'm sure you'll all enjoy it. So in my capacity as Vice Chair of the Committee for the Environment, I'd like to officially welcome you all to today's seminar. It focuses on planning from three perspectives: shoreline, marine and landscape. Today's presentations consider the importance of each in planning and how each must not be thought of in isolation of the others. They address themes of particular interest to the Environment Committee. You may recall in 2012 the Committee considered the Marine Bill as it progressed through the Assembly, culminating in the enactment in May 2013 of the Marine Act, Northern Ireland 2013. But the Committee's interest in these topics did not stop at that point. The Committee remains involved in considering ongoing developments in these areas, with the 2013 Act in place. And for example, in March 2015, the Committee participated in a workshop on the development of marine conservation zones, or MCZs as we know them in Northern Ireland, which was hosted by the Department of Environment. And as I said earlier, the Committee is interested in today's seminar to hear about the academics' research findings on themes that are of interest to the Committee. Our first speaker, Professor Andrew Cooper from the University of Ulster, will explore the lack of a strategic approach to the shoreline management in Northern Ireland, and will share examples from elsewhere to demonstrate how this concept can be integrated into the planning system. The second presentation is delivered by Professor Greg Lloyd from the University of Ulster and Professor Deborah Peel from the University of Dundee. And they will explain the importance of an integrated and coordinated terrestrial, coastal and marine planning approach in order to unleash this island's offshore renewable energy potential and to develop a sustainable blue economy. Finally, the last presentation will focus on the terrestrial aspect of the land, coastal and marine relationship discussed by previous presenters. Drawing on her research findings, Mrs. Emily Smith from the University of Ulster will set out the important role of landscape planning when seeking to protect individuals' rights. This is of particular interest given that councils recently have adopted new planning, community planning and urban regeneration rules. So I now hand over to our speakers, and I'm sure you'll all be looking forward to the presentations and to the discussions afterwards. So with that, I'm going to leave you and wish you a very pleasant afternoon.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm going to kick things off by talking about shoreline management planning, which is something we don't have in Northern Ireland. We're the only part of the UK and one of the few countries in Europe that doesn't have a strategic approach to shoreline management. And I'm going to explore the reasons perhaps why we don't have it, but why we need it, and some steps that we might take to put it into place. So the coast of Northern Ireland, as we all know, is diverse, scenic, beautiful. It's the basis of a whole variety of economic interests. It delivers a range of services to us. And in some cases we're aware of the value of those. In other cases we sort of take them as read. But we do have a strikingly beautiful coastline, exemplified here by the White Rocks, County Antrim. But there are other values that we don't always see. The coast does have its scenic beauty. It has importance for recreation for our own population. It's important for attracting tourists to come here. It's important for well-being. It provides an ecosystem, a lot of which we don't see because it's either buried in the sand or it's in the water adjacent to the sand. It's a natural sea defence, which is something I'll focus on a little bit later. And it's also an important filter. It filters our waste material. It cleans up the waste before it reaches the ocean. And it acts as a perfect natural buffer against almost everything that the ocean throws at us. We sometimes quantify those and give them a value in terms of what we call ecosystem services. And it's defined in the National Ecosystem Assessment as the benefits provided by ecosystems that make life worth living. So there I am deriving some ecosystem services, not in Northern Ireland but in the Caribbean, but nonetheless in a coastal environment. A bit closer to home, we see the exploitation of our coastal ecosystem services here at Portrush. We've economic activity going on, we've got recreation and tourism taking place on one of those rare sunny days. But there are other services that are perhaps less quantifiable. We sometimes call them cultural services. And they mean things as perhaps that we take as for granted, things like donkey riding on the beach, punch and judy shows, regular events that take place on beaches, and so on. They're things that we take for granted, but which we place a good deal of reliance on for our community and social well-being. Now, we do all of that in the context of a coastline that changes. One of the most important attributes of coasts are that they change from time to time. And that change can sometimes be progressive or gradual. It's barely perceptible except over long periods of time. In other cases, it's quite episodic and you see the change instantly. And there's been a good deal of press coverage lately about the changes on the north coast, the lack of sand on very many beaches. The storms that took place last winter and the winter before caused dramatic changes. Those are in the realm of episodic changes, but as we see, our coast is subject to both these short-term episodic changes and long-term progressive changes. There's Portstewart on a typical summer's day. We can have several thousand cars parked on there, making use of those resources. There it is on an atypical day. It was in a storm in 2005 when the entire beach was covered by the sea. It's not a common event. It happens only a few times each decade, but the coastline responded perfectly well. The dunes were eroded for a short time, but in the subsequent months and years they recovered. The beach went back to normal. Here's the white rocks at Portrush last summertime. Lots of sand, lots of activity. Here it is a month and a half ago. Much of that sand is gone, exposing the underlying gravel. But that has happened before. It has exposed sea defences that were only put in 1980 and have been covered by a sand dune ever since. So we know that the sand comes and goes at those sites. It hasn't left the coastline, it's going to come back on shore. But it causes a lot of panic when people see changes like that. At the other end of the scale, we can see slow progressive change on certain parts of our coast, most notably the South Down coast. This is in the coast near Kilkeel. And here we have slowly eroding cliffs. As those cliffs erode, they deliver sand and gravel to the beach. The waves that are coming in at an angle to the coast slowly wash that away until the cliffs become destabilised again and fresh sediment is introduced. So we need cliff erosion there to sustain the beach. If we didn't have cliff erosion, the sand will be carried away and there'll be no beach left. Unfortunately, we often have infrastructure, buildings, roads, parklands, golf courses in areas that are within the zone where the coastline changes. And that produces us problems. Here's a headline from the Morn Observer after the storms of last winter. People being concerned about their houses and most particularly their access roads being washed away and demanding that something be done. Now, it's not an uncommon situation. Around the world there are lots of places where there's a coastal erosion problem. What we don't appreciate most of the time, though, is that the coastal erosion problem is the infrastructure. If there was no infrastructure there, there'd be no coastal erosion problem. This would be just like the white rocks. The sand could come and go, the beach could move back and forwards. No one would notice, no one would really care. The coastline can take perfectly good care of itself. But when you build things close to the coastline, then you create an erosion problem. If I swing around 180 degrees from this view, this is in the southeast coast of Spain, you see the erosion problem up close. Those pillars on the beach are not pillars at all, those are manholes going down to the sewage line. So the beach has dropped quite a bit since those were put in. It's also got a lot narrower. And the owners of that property are faced with a dilemma. They're threatened with undermining and collapse, And clearly something needs to be done in a situation like that. The key issue here is that storms and climate change are not a threat to coasts. Coasts can generally take care of themselves very well. It's buildings, infrastructure and development that is a threat to the coast, because it limits our ability to, it limits the coast's ability to change. And that's really the crux of the matter here. And it's the reason why we need a strategic approach to shoreline management. To illustrate the point a little bit further, our infrastructural efforts at protecting the coast usually don't work at best. At worst, they damage the coast temporarily or irrevocably. Here's a seawall at Cushendall that collapsed last winter with a concerned councillor standing on it. Here's the seawall in February '96, also collapsed then. There had been a sand dune there before for several thousand years. The sand dune had eroded and accumulated periodically over that time. It didn't need any interference. It restored itself and sustained itself. The seawall that was put in to protect the golf club doesn't stand up to winter storms, gets undermined from time to time and has to be rebuilt. Here's another example at County Down, Slieve Donard Hotel. After a storm in 2002, its seawall collapsed and had to be built again at great expense. And last winter we saw lots of pictures like this one on the TV about the crisis caused in a lot of coastal communities by winter storms. Now here was a bus washed into the ocean. People had to be rescued from it. It looked dramatic on the TV, but when you look at where that bus was during the storm, there's the road running along the back of the beach. So you have to ask yourself, was it the driver? What was the driver doing driving on a road like that in the middle of a storm? It wasn't the storm that was the problem. It was a bad decision by someone to use that road, and perhaps an even worse decision to put a road in that location in the first place. But we see that time and time again, and we panic whenever we see that kind of dramatic impact. Here's the railway line at Dawlish, undermined last year, rebuilt at a cost of several £1 million. The reason is that it's sitting on the beach. The beach that used to be there has now got a railway track on top of it. It's no longer able to absorb the incoming wave energy, so the railway line collapsed. Aberystwyth also made the news for many weeks. The reverse is happening here. Instead of being eroded, the esplanade has been covered with gravel from the beach. So it's been thrown up onto the beach, and the gravel's gone through people's windows and damaged them. It turns out that was nothing new. It had happened in 1938, and it happened in 1927. And the reason is that when the Aberystwyth Promenade was built, it was built on the beach. Okay, so they built a wall on the beach, filled in behind it. So where the road is, it's not surprising that we find gravel periodically being thrown from the beach onto the road. The road's where the beach used to be. So when we are faced with these issues of infrastructure close to the coastline and threatened by coastal change, we really have two options. We can divide it up in many different ways, but the real two options are these. We can retreat and give the coastline space, or we can try and hold the line, and we can do both of those in different ways. And I'm just going to explore those briefly for a moment. This is an example of what I call passive retreat. It means that you don't do anything, you let the coastline move, and if infrastructure is in the way, you have to let it collapse. It's bad news for the owner of the house, but very good news for the beach, because the sand that beach needs is just like the sand on the County Down coast. Without cliff erosion, the beach disappears. So as long as that cliff continues to erode, the beach continues to survive. Here's another example in Beachy Head, owned by the National Trust, who have a policy of not interfering with coastal processes. That photograph's from 1985. The modern shoreline's back beyond that red arrow at the present time. Some houses have gone, but the key thing is that erosion of the cliff has continued. It's continued to supply the flints that build up the beach, and so the landscape has been preserved, and it hasn't cost anyone anything. Here's a more dramatic example in North Carolina. That, in its heyday, would have been worth more than $1 million as a beachfront house. It's a little bit ramshackle now because the dune on which it was built is now gone. The septic tank's exposed over there on the left-hand side. It's been condemned, but the beach has simply moved past. The houses are not allowed to get in the way of natural processes. A little bit closer to home, here's an example from the Western Isles of Scotland, affected badly by a storm in 2007. This was a school. The gravel was thrown from the beach into the school, damaged, filled the playground, broke the windows. They've decided to abandon that school, rebuild one somewhere else. So it's another example of passive retreat. But we can also be active. If there are important buildings that are worth preserving or people really want to preserve, it is possible to move them. There are many examples around the world. This is one on the right-hand side, a farmhouse being moved to make way for the Channel Tunnel rail link. So it is possible for us to move historic buildings, and not just small ones. People have been moving buildings for many years. This is in the outback of Australia, a rather strange mode of moving a building, but nonetheless can be done. But it's not just small shacks like that. Lighthouses have been moved backwards. This is the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse in North Carolina. It's jacked off its foundations, moved back about half a mile on a temporary railway line, and then reinstated. So it's possible and, in fact, desirable for us to move important buildings back. Here's a hotel in New Jersey being moved in the 1800s. It was owned by a railway company, so you can see that they were able to muster the necessary locomotives and track to pull the hotel back from the edge. But it preserved the hotel, it allowed the beach to continue to move, and allowed us to coexist with the changing shoreline. So the advantages of retreating from the shoreline are quite numerous. It responds to changes in sea level, it preserves the beach, it can save on shoreline stabilisation costs, we can preserve buildings, and it's sustainable. It doesn't, for the most part, require any input. The coastline, if we give it space, can take care of itself perfectly well. The disadvantages of retreat are first and foremost that it's politically difficult. It's very hard to say to someone, I'm afraid your house is going to have to fall in the sea. But as I'll show in a moment, sometimes that is for the greater good. A property is owned by one person, whereas the adjacent beach can be used by thousands of people and deliver benefits to thousands of people. So sometimes when we zoom out a little bit, we can make a more sustainable decision. It's potentially costly, depending on what initiatives we use to move things back from the coastline, and it does result in a loss of land and property. The alternative is to try and hold the shoreline in place, and we can do that through what are called hard defences or soft defences. Now, this is the end point of hard defences in Japan. That shoreline isn't going anywhere. It's been covered in precast tetrapod blocks, and it's protected the infrastructure behind it very well. But it's quite unsightly. The beach that used to be there is buried under those tetrapod blocks. The environment is fundamentally changed. Here's another endpoint in New Jersey where they first started shoreline engineering to protect beachfront properties. This used to be a beautiful sandy beach. The small houses in at the back were beachfront properties. But because the shoreline was retreating, the first effort was to hold the shoreline in place by building groins. Those failed to hold it in place, so they put in sea walls. Those resulted in the loss of the beach, so more groins were put in, and eventually one thing has led to another, and it looks now more like a scrapyard than a natural beach. Here's another example, a little bit closer to home, where the final straw after this beach was continually washed away was to tarmac the beach. People still use it. You see photographs on the internet of people lying on towels on there in the summertime, but it's not the sort of thing that would draw a tourist to an area and encourage them to come back. So hard defences have the single advantage that they protect property. Their disadvantages are that they destroy beaches, because when a beach is moving landwards and you put a barrier in the way, it gets squeezed out. They damage the ecosystem as the beach is lost. It destroys the scenery, as you saw from those few examples. It looks horrendous. And there's the cost of installation and maintenance. It's not just a one-off, as you saw from the examples I showed earlier. Seawalls collapse and have to be maintained. So you've got the cost of installation and the cost of maintenance forever and ever. The alternative in holding the shoreline is to use soft defences, and it's widespread in other parts of the world. There are no examples in Northern Ireland, and only 1 or 2 tests in the south. But this is typically what it involves: taking sand from somewhere else and pumping it onto a beach. In this case, it's gravel being pumped from the near shore onto the beach. It's very widespread in the United States. Here's a beach nourishment scheme in Atlantic Beach, New Jersey. Turns the beach into an engineering project or a building site for a time, but it restores a beach. It has the advantage of recreating a beach, albeit an unnatural one, and it can preserve buildings, but it has the disadvantages of cost and maintenance, which must be done forever. The question of where you get the sand from and the environmental impacts of that. The damage that you do to the beach ecosystem and the place where you took the sand from, and the fact that we need more and more sand as sea level rises. If you're trying to hold the shoreline in place by pumping sand onto it, if sea level rises, you've got to pump more and more sand. So where do we stand in Northern Ireland? We have 3 key devices, I suppose, that contribute to our efforts in shoreline management. One is the Bateman formula, which is a very old handwritten note from the head of one ministry to another in the days of the old Northern Ireland government, indicating that whichever department had the closest responsibility to an area where the coastline was eroding should take responsibility for it. So if it was agricultural land, the Department of Agriculture should take responsibility. If it was roads, then whatever the Department of Transport was in those days would take responsibility. We do then have also planning guidance, which dates from the 1970s, but it does say that we shouldn't normally grant permission for building in areas subject to coastal erosion. However, as I'll show you in a moment, that seems to be largely forgotten. And most recently, we have marine licensing, which is requiring any structure below the high water mark to seek a licence. That's a distinct step in the right direction, but it also has its shortcomings because people make applications to do only one thing, which is to defend their property. No one makes application to retreat from the coastline or give the coastline space. So it's a rather blunt instrument, but it is a step in the right direction. The trouble is we have no strategic approach, and without a strategic approach, we end up with a concrete line shoreline. Okay? It's not because anyone decided that we shouldn't do, but because no one decided that we should have a concrete line shoreline, but no one decided that we shouldn't have. We don't have an option for selecting any other thing than defences. So let me just show you a few examples. And no matter where you drive in Northern Ireland, you see hard sea defences. Here's some on the outer ards, various ages and structures protecting roads, particularly roads with very extensive defences, sometimes protecting houses, sometimes car parks. Here's Ballyholme and Bangor, one of the few examples of groins on the beach. Every time you get a house near the coast, you find some kind of armour in front of it. If it wasn't for those, we wouldn't have any armour there. The coastline would be much more natural. It's McGilligan Point. And we use all sorts of infrastructure. There are all sorts of structures to build them. An old cattle grid, old bits of concrete pipe, old bits of broken up building material, white rocks at the Royal Portrush Golf Club, gabion baskets to protect the Mourne Path. Interesting that they didn't think to just move the path the other side of that fence, for starters. That would be an example of retreat in an active way, and it's such a small step to make. And the protection of a caravan park, bearing in mind that caravans are on wheels and even easier to move than lighthouses and other buildings. There's some spectacular follies around the coast. There's one of them. A sea wall doing nothing. I imagine it was a winter storm and the council had some money left over at the end of the financial year and built a wall. But here's maybe the jewel in the crown, if you like, or the turd in the punch bowl, to be more appropriate. Clocky's Wall of Shame, I call it. In spite of there being planning guidance saying we won't normally build in areas subject to coastal erosion. This was a site that had already been eroded. It could only be reinstated by building that wall, backfilling behind it in order to create the building site. So in spite of there being some provision for preventing these kind of problems, we obviously are ignoring them to a large extent. What I am calling for is a strategic approach that allows us to think about retreat. It is a viable option in a lot of places. I acknowledge there are many places where we can't retreat, but there are many places where we should be doing so. And to facilitate it, there are lots of different instruments that can be used. In a few states in the US, there are rolling easements that allow you to use the land up to the point that it's eroded. Some countries use buyouts of property that's at risk of erosion. We can legislate, use compulsory purchase. We can refuse planning permission to defend property that's in a site. There's no compulsion on government to defend or on private citizens to be allowed to defend. And we can use planning in a much more robust way to prevent buildings being put in the wrong place. And I think what we need is something along the lines of shoreline management plans that are used in England, Scotland and Wales. There, every piece of the coastline is assessed, a process of engagement with communities is involved, and every stretch of coast is assigned to a category of holding the line, retreating, advancing, or retreating progressively through a process of managed realignment. We lack all of that, and without that kind of approach, we are going to end up with our coastline, from which we derive so many ecosystem services, so much economic benefit, being transformed into a rim of concrete and losing all that benefit that it gives to us. So that's my bottom line. I think we really do need to wake up to the need for a strategic approach to shoreline management in Northern Ireland. So, thank you.